Happy Halloween, everybody. It is October 31st, 2023, and it is Spoken World Online, week number 190. This is our 190th show. Wow. I'm going to start with a Halloween poem by our friend Lee Dunlap. And then I will continue with the next paragraphs from the Fritz Leiber story, Lean Times in Lonkmar. So here we go first by Lee Dunlap. Pumpkinhead. My nose has fallen off and my eyes have dropped inward. The candle which has lighted this fever has melted the inside of my head, and there is mold forming outside. The moisture of rot has slid down my being, and spores are thrown out to unsuspecting trick-or-treaters. I have fallen in. This is worse than an out-of-body experience. To be a pumpkinhead is not a treat. Okay, and now paragraphs from Lean Times in Lonkmar by Fritz Leiber. And let's see, where were we? The gods in Lonkmar, that is, the gods and candidates for divinity who dwell or camp, it may be said, in the imperishable city, not the gods of Lonkmar, a very different and most secret and dire matter. The gods in Lonkmar sometimes seem as if they must be as numberless as the grains of sand in the great eastern desert. The vast majority of them began as men, or more strictly, the memories of men who led aesthetic, vision-haunted lives and died painful, messy deaths. One gets the impression that since the beginning of time, an unending horde of their priests and apostles, or even the gods themselves, it makes little difference, have been crippling across that same desert, the sinking land, and the great salt marsh to converge on Lonkmar's low, heavy-arched marsh gate. Meanwhile, suffering by the way various inevitable tortures, castrations, blindings, and stonings, impalements, crucifixions, quarterings, and so forth at the hands of Eastern brigands and mingle unbelievers who one is tempted to think were created solely for the purpose of seeing to the running of that cruel gauntlet. Among the tormented holy throng are a few warlocks and witches seeking infernal immortality for their dark, satanic would-be deities, and a very few proto-goddesses, generally maidens reputed to have been enslaved for decades by sadistic magicians and ravished by whole tribes of Mingol. Lonkmar itself, and especially the earlier mentioned street, serves as a theater, or more precisely, the intellectual and artistic testing ground of the proto-gods after their more material but no more cruel sifting in the hands of the brigands and Mingols. A new god, his priest, or priests, that is, will begin at the marsh gate and more or less slowly work his way up the street of the gods, renting a temple or preempting a few yards of cobbled pavement here and there until he has found his proper level. A very few win their way to the region adjoining the citadel and join the aristocracy of the gods in Lonkmar. transient still, though resident there for centuries and even millennia. The gods of Lochmar are as jealous as they are secret. Far more godlets, it can justly be said, play a one-night stand near the marsh gate and abruptly disappear, perhaps to seek cities where the audiences are less critical. The majority work their way about halfway up the street of the gods and then slowly work their way down again, resisting bitterly every inch and yard until they once more reach the marsh gate and vanish forever from Lochmar and the memories of men. Now, Isic of the Jug, whom Fafhrd chose to serve, was one of the most lowly and unsuccessful of the godlets rather, in Lochmar. He had dwelt there for about 13 years, during which time he had traveled only 2 squares up the street of the gods and was now back again, ready for oblivion. He is not to be confused with Isic the Armless, Isic of the burnt legs, flayed Isic, or any other of the numerous and colorfully mutilated divinities of that name. Indeed, his unpopularity may have been due in part to the fact that the manner of his death, racking, was not deemed particularly spectacular. A few scholars have confused him with Jug Isic, an entirely different saintlet whose claim to immortality lay in his confinement for 17 years in a not overly roomy earthenware jar. The jug, Isic of the Jug's jug, was supposed to contain waters of peace from the cistern of Silivat, but none apparently thirsted for them. Indeed, had you sought for a good example of a has-been win the center of the street, they passed back and forth. Has never really been anything. You could hardly hit on a better choice than Isic of the Jug, while Baudris was the very type of the failed priest, serial, senile, apologetic, and mumbling. The reason that Fafhrd attached to Baudris rather than to any of the vast number of livelier holy men with better prospects was that he had seen Baudris pat a deaf and dumb child on the head, while, so far as Baudris could have known, no one was looking. And the incident, possibly unique in Lochmar, had stuck in the mind of the barbarian. But otherwise, Baudris was the most unexceptional old dodderer. However, Fafhrd, after Fafhrd became his acolyte, things somehow began to change. In the first place, and even if he had contributed nothing else, Fafhrd made a very impressive one-man congregation. From the very first day when he turned up so ragged-looking and bloody from the cuts breaking his longsword. His near 7-foot height and still warlike carriage stood out mountainously among the old women, children, and assorted riffraff who made up the odorous, noisy, and vastly fickle crowd of worshippers at the marsh gate end of the street of the gods. One could not help thinking that if Isic of the Jug could attract one such worshipper, the godlet must have unsuspected virtues. Fafhrd's formidable height, shoulder breadth, and bearing had one other advantage. He could maintain claim to a very respectable area of cobbles, for Baudris and Isic merely by stretching himself to sleep on them after the night's services were over. And if you want to hear more, you'll have to come back in subsequent weeks, but I will put a link to the text in the chat. Thanks everybody for indulging me.